Okay, we're going to start pulling out our cork rails. So these are all cut on the CNC machine, and they're cut with a bit that leaves them in place just a little bit. This is to make it a little bit safer to ship so they don't break. There's 4 layers of rail bands that are going to go on the board, and each one is labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's little joints at the ends that we'll show you how those fit together. But to start out, we're just going to cut out the number 1 rail bands. Those are obviously the tallest ones because they're the first ones to go on the board. So anything that's labeled number 1, we're going to cut those out with a utility knife. Okay, so these were cut with a V-bit. So the bit just goes down just shy of the bottom. So you can kind of see how they're cut. And you want to work on a hard piece of wood and then just take a utility knife and just run it right along those cuts. Should be pretty easy. It'll follow that cut line, and just that, it'll pop right out. So we're going to go along and cut out each one that's labeled number 1. Okay, so we have our first layer of cork cut out and ready to go on the board. A couple things to remember, like these cork rails are actually stepped, so the first layer that goes on is the tallest one, and as you add them, they get shorter and shorter, and we'll talk about why that is later on. But these number 1 parts, they're coded, so there's letters and different codes that tell you where the ends are going to line up. So A obviously goes with A, D goes with D, and so on. The other part of this that gives you kind of some clue as to where to start is there's a little hole in most of these pieces, and that is CNC'd, and it corresponds with a hole in the plywood rail band. So as far as how these register, one thing to look at is make sure you're looking, the inscriptions go out, but you also want to make sure you're looking at the rocker of these pieces. So this goes up around near the nose of the board. You can see there's rocker to it. So we wouldn't want to put it on the board that way where the rocker's going down. But as long as the inscriptions are out, it should be pretty self-explanatory. Okay, on the mini Simmons, we're actually going to start like putting the tailpiece on the board first, because everything else will kind of overlap that. So if you look at this, you can kind of see the middle of the band. It's the lowest point of the bottom contours, but you can just measure this and find the center line, and that's going to line up with that keel. So we're going to glue this on with some grizzly glue and a little bit of water. So to start out, we're going to use grizzly glue and just put some right across the tail. I like to take a little stick and kind of smear that around. We like to use a little bit of water. It kind of helps as a catalyst to help the glue cure a little bit faster. You don't have to, but it does help a little bit. So I'm going to spray the cork just with a little misting of water, and I'm going to place that right in the middle. And then we glue these on. Actually, I found the easiest way is with a little bit of tape. So I like to tape it. And kind of stretch it top and bottom and stick it down. This green 3M tape tends to have a little bit of stretchiness to it, so you can actually put it on and add a little bit of tension before you stick it down. And then for a few minutes you can still adjust this into position. The main thing with these rail bands is we want everything registered with the bottom planks. So don't worry about what's happening up top. We want this to be nice and flush with the bottom of the board. Pro tip here, to help distribute the pressure, because sometimes this tape only pulls in the spots where it is, the cork can get pushed out a little bit between the tape. Use your strong backs and you can bend those on and tape them, and they'll help distribute the pressure across the whole length of the cork that you're putting on. Okay, now that this tailpiece is pretty much dry, I just took my block of wood with some 80 grit and just very lightly sanded it until I blended it in with that outline of the board. And what that's going to do is when we go to put this next piece on, it'll just wrap right around and come in contact, and then we'll do the same thing on this piece. We're going to start off here on the right side of the board, and this little hole in the cork lines up with this little hole in the rail band. So before we put any glue on here, we're just going to hold it in place, basically where it goes, and then up here at this forward end, I just want to put a little mark so I know where to run my glue to. If some squeezes out, we can clean it up, but this will kind of remind us how far forward we're going to apply glue. We've got our glue applied to our board. I put some water on our cork, and I'm just going to take that hole. You could even stick a pencil in here, I think, if you wanted to register that, but it's pretty straightforward to line that right up. I like to have a couple pieces of tape kind of ready to go. And once again, as we get working here, we want to make sure that the bottom is lined up even with the bottom planks. If the top is a little tall or a little short, don't worry so much about that because there's a lot more shaping to do on the top. So we want this to be just about flush with the bottom planks. Okay, so once you have this kind of held in place, I think this is a good place again to take one of your strong backs and put it on there and just tape that right on the board to help spread the load. And my rule of thumb is if there's any play, if there's any movement in the cork, I want to add a piece of tape. If it seems like it's tight and it's not moving, then we should be in good shape. So kind of get it clamped down and then give it a good, a good sighting and just add some pieces where you need them. Okay, with this piece on, we're going to take our next piece. You can see how they kind of lock together. This little puzzle joint on the end of there registers with this one. When we go to glue it, we just want to engage that and make sure we kind of push it back just a little bit to make sure that's as tight as we can get it. Whatever little gap is there will kind of be covered by the next layer. And we're just going to glue that on the same way and work our way around the nose and back to the other side of the board. Our glue is dry on our first rail bands. We pulled the tape off. Everything looked pretty good. There was one little spot here, which I'll show you, there was a little gap, so I pulled that back in, let it sit for a few minutes. Otherwise, everything looked great. Before we get on with the next rail bands, just a couple quick things we're gonna do. I took a little quick second with some sandpaper and a block of wood and just sanded. If the cork was hanging over the bottom planks a little bit or extending above the bottom planks, I just kind of gently sanded them so they were a little bit closer. If there was anything that was kind of jagged, any glue, I just flattened it off so it's pretty easy to see where I want that next rail band to go. So back here where this rail band extends off the back of the board, just use some 80 grit, and I always try to sand just in the direction that the cork is going. If I sand this way, then I risk maybe breaking that piece off. So you just kind of sand and try to blend that right in so the next pieces can ride right over them. That's about it. Okay, right here we had a little gap where I just must not have taped it real well. So I just took a knife and I cleaned out the glue that had hardened until I could squeeze this back in again. And just added a little glue and water and pulled it in with a couple blocks of wood to kind of spread the load and make sure it was pulling it in evenly and not putting a dent in the cork. So we'll just let that dry for a few minutes. All right, so we're ready for our layer number 2. I've got things laid out so I know where they're going. Obviously, the tail piece, everything else is pretty easy to identify, lining up the A to A and the D to D and things like that. One thing to note is that these joints are not going to line up on each layer. That's done on purpose, so we don't have a joint kind of lining up all the way out through the rails. So if you notice that this doesn't land in the same place, that's good and fine. One last reminder, we've got the board upside down, so the bottom planks are facing up, and that's how we want to work now. So we're just going to start off by putting the tailpiece on, and once that's dry, we'll start adding the next rail layer. And really from here on out, it's the same thing with each step. Let the glue dry, untape it, give it a quick clean up just so you know where that next layer lands, and add it on. And that's it, we'll be ready to shape.